There are moments in life when we step into a place and instantly feel safe. A hospital is one of those places. The scent of antiseptic, the soft echo of footsteps on clean floors, the quiet confidence of doctors and nurses moving with purpose. These details tell us we're somewhere protected, somewhere dedicated to life. But safety is an illusion that can shatter without warning. Sometimes fear enters through doors meant for healing, and no one inside realizes they are living the final, peaceful minutes before everything changes forever. The sun hung lazily over the southern Thai district that afternoon, casting a warm glow over the small Jaw Aerong hospital. It wasn't a grand structure, not the kind that appeared on postcards or in tourist guides. Yet for the people of the community, it stood like a guardian of hope. Families often described it as the one place where life felt predictable, where pain met comfort, and where suffering had a chance to ease. Mothers carried their children through its doors with trust. Elders arrived seeking relief. The young came in with worry and left with reassurance. The hospital was part of the community's heartbeat, as familiar as the local market or the neighborhood temple. Inside, the day moved in its usual rhythm. Nurses walked through corridors with charts pressed to their chests. A doctor murmured calm instructions to a patient who feared her diagnosis. A janitor polished the tiles until they reflected the overhead light in smooth, perfect lines. Machines beeped softly in patient rooms, not as alarms, but as steady reassurance that life was being monitored and cared for. If one listened closely, one could even hear the gentle laughter of a child in the waiting room, entertained by a simple toy while his mother gently stroked his hair. It was a scene so ordinary that it felt untouchable, as if wrapped in a protective bubble that kept the chaos of the outside world far away. But the outside world was not truly distant. Beyond the hospital walls, past the quiet roads and the waving palm trees, tension simmered beneath the surface of everyday life. The region had long lived between fragile peace and sudden unrest, caught in the crossfire of political and ideological conflict. Yet people clung to the belief that the hospital would always remain neutral territory. Here, the unwritten rule of humanity stood firm. No matter who you were, what you believed, or where you came from, the hospital would treat you. It was one of the last places where compassion overcame division. That afternoon, a young nurse named Mali, known for her calm presence, stood near the entrance organizing patient files. She was 5 months pregnant, a fact that made colleagues unusually protective of her. She often rested her hand on her belly as she worked, feeling the faint flutters of new life growing inside her. Mali had always believed in the goodness of people, and the hospital reinforced that belief daily. She didn't know it yet, but she would soon find herself wishing she could hold on to that belief with the same tenderness she held her unborn child. Outside, a light breeze moved through the trees. A stray dog slept lazily near the front steps. A delivery truck approached, raising a small trail of dust behind it. Nothing about the scene hinted that life was about to pivot toward the unthinkable. If someone had paused to look around, really look, they might have noticed the unusual stillness in the air, a silence that carried weight, as if nature itself sensed what humans did not. The clock ticked forward, innocent and unaware. Mali greeted a new patient with a smile, and somewhere in the hospital, a kettle clicked as water finished boiling for a nurse's tea break. Routine wrapped the building like a blanket, and then, without any sound or warning to mark the transition, that blanket began to slip away. A shift was coming, one that would peel away the sense of safety layer by layer. But for now, the staff and patients continued their day, believing they were in a place shielded from fear. No one inside the hospital had any reason to imagine that before the sun set, their sense of sanctuary would be torn apart, and the ideals the hospital represented — care, trust, compassion, would be pushed to the edge of survival. The first sign that something was different that day arrived quietly, like a shadow stretching across the floor without anyone noticing where it came from. It began with an unexpected pause in the hospital's natural rhythm. Molly sensed it before she understood it. She was preparing a routine check-in form for a patient when she realized the waiting room, usually filled with soft chatter, had fallen into an odd hush. A mother, comforting her child, did so without words. A man with a bandaged hand stared at the entrance, distracted, as if listening for something beyond the doors. Even the child who had laughed earlier was now silent, his toy motionless between his fingers. It wasn't fear yet, just a subtle shift, the kind that tightens the air before a storm. Molly tried to brush off the feeling. Hospitals had quiet moments all the time. Perhaps people were simply tired, or the afternoon heat had drawn the energy out of them. She placed the form aside and stepped into the hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly overhead, not enough to alarm her, but enough to make her slow her steps. She walked past the nurse station, where two colleagues whispered. Instead of speaking at their usual volume, their faces held a seriousness that didn't match the peaceful tasks of the day. One of them glanced at the front windows again, as if expecting something, or someone. Outside, the stray dog had left its resting spot. The delivery truck that had arrived earlier sat with its door slightly open, but no delivery staff was in sight. A motorcycle idled on the far side of the street, its engine running without a rider, the sound low and uneasy. A security guard, stationed at the entrance, stood unusually alert, his hand resting near his walkie-talkie, eyes fixed on the road rather than greeting patients. Small details, isolated and harmless on their own, but together they painted a picture Molly didn't want to interpret. She approached the guard, curious. He gave her a brief nod, but didn't smile. When she asked if everything was all right, he hesitated before answering. "Maybe just my imagination," he said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. "Some unfamiliar men on the road earlier, they looked around too much." He tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out thin and uncomfortable. Molly forced a smile in return, but as she walked back inside, she instinctively placed her hand on her belly again. In the staff room, a kettle warmed on its base, steam curling upward in delicate threads. Normally, this was a safe space where nurses shared snacks, exchanged stories, and caught their breath. But today, even the staff room felt tense, as if the walls absorbed the unspoken worries. A nurse named Suda sat at the table, her cup untouched. She stared through the glass window at the hospital grounds, eyes narrowed. When Molly greeted her, Suda blinked, as though pulled from a distant thought. "I don't like the quiet today," she admitted. "It feels wrong." Molly didn't argue. The feeling had already rooted itself in her. She checked the clock. Time was moving as it always did, second by second, but the atmosphere stretched those seconds. Thin, as if each one carried too much weight. A sound echoed from the hallway, just the clatter of a dropped clipboard, but several people flinched. Molly recognized it for what it was, tension tightening its grip, drawing nerves closer to the edge. A doctor walked past, speaking quickly to another member of the staff. Their eyes shifted toward the entrance, more often than toward their patients. Even the hospital's PA system, which usually chimed for routine announcements, remained silent. The absence of familiar sounds made the unfamiliar ones sharper. Footsteps that seemed too hurried, the distant motorcycle still idling, voices murmuring in clipped sentences. Molly tried to steady her breathing. She reminded herself that fear often arrived before facts. Still, she couldn't shake the sense that the hospital was holding its breath, that everyone inside had stepped into a moment where normalcy balanced on a fragile thread, ready to snap. The day continued, but no longer with the ease it began with. Each minute seemed to ask the same unspoken question: what is coming? And although no one could yet name it, something was coming. It was close enough for instinct to sense, but still hidden from sight, like thunder rumbling beyond distant clouds, felt but not yet seen. The hospital, once filled with the warmth of routine life, now carried an invisible chill, the kind that made people speak softer, walk slower, and listen harder. No one understood why, but deep down, they all felt it. The day had shifted, and the line between safety and danger had begun to blur. They appeared as if the walls had learned to breathe, and then exhaled men in dark clothing into the corridor. No slam of doors, no shouted orders, just figures where, a heartbeat earlier, there had been empty space. The first one raised a finger to his lips, a universal command older than language. Another turned a palm down and pressed the air, lowering it, telling everyone to keep the noise of their own existence to a minimum. The silence they brought with them was heavier than any sound could have been. It settled over the corridor, over Marley, over the patients, like a blanket that smothered breath. Marley's instincts leapt ahead of thought. Her hand went to her belly and stayed there. One of the men stepped close enough for her to smell metal and dust. He did not touch her at first. He simply looked, measuring the space between fear and obedience, and then presented a narrow band of plastic. With a precise, almost courteous tilt of his wrist, she understood. A nod. She extended her hands, palms trembling. The click of tightened plastic ties was so small it barely existed, yet it felt louder than thunder. They turned her gently, not cruel, not kind, only efficient. One man's eyes slid to her abdomen, and he made a small motion to another. Careful. Around them, people froze in mid-gesture. A patient halted with a cup of water halfway to his lips. A doctor's pen hovered over a chart and never touched the page. The armed men moved like a practiced choreography, pairs peeling off to seal the exits, one passing through the waiting room with a flat, expressionless scan of faces. Another opened the door to the administration office and, with a quick twist of fingers, instructed the staff inside to stand and back away from the phones. No smashing yet. An unplugged cable lifted and fell like a faint sigh. The hospital's voice, the lines, the alerts, the intercom, was being muted, thread by thread. Suda, at the nurse station, slid her chair back with the softest scrape. A gloved hand lowered onto the backrest and eased it forward again. He pointed to the monitors, then to the ceiling cameras, then to the tiny DVR tower tucked under the desk. She nodded. He traced a square in the air and then drew a diagonal slash through it. Off. She reached beneath the counter, fingers fumbling, and found the switch. The monitor went black. Somewhere in the building, a little green light surrendered to darkness. It felt like the hospital itself closed one eye and began to see less of what was happening to it. In the pediatric bay, a child whimpered, the most human sound in the building. A man in the doorway turned his head, not to silence the child, but to measure the room, the windows, the sightlines. He raised 2 fingers and then placed them on his own chest. Me. Then he hooked those fingers toward the window. There. Positions were claimed with gestures, territory redrawn, without ink. Another pair drifted toward the stairwell, their boots soft, their weapons low, their faces behind fabric that hid everything but the calm of their purpose. They were not hunting anyone inside. They were building a shape for something outside. The security guard at the entrance stood with his hands open, empty, his walkie-talkie left on the desk in plain view, as if to prove he would not touch it. A man nodded once and slid the device into his pocket. Another produced a length of tape and sealed the front door's latch, not to trap, but to slow. Time was being kneaded, stretched, made elastic, so that anyone trying to enter or exit would move through syrup. At the far end of the corridor, an elevator chimed and opened to no one. A man stepped in, pressed the top floor, and let the doors close on his silence. Marley counted her breaths. In, out. The baby shifted under her palm as if aware of the new gravity inside the building. A man directed her with a small tilt of the head. Toward a bench. She sat. He knelt, checked the plastic at her wrists, and made a quick adjustment so it wouldn't bite the skin. Not mercy, calculation. People who bleed or cry make noise. Noise attracts attention. Their silence depended on keeping everyone intact. He stood and moved on, leaving behind the faint scent of oil and rain, and the impression that he had touched the air rather than the people in it. Time diluted. The corridor widened and narrowed with the rhythm of pulse. Without the phones, without the soft chime of the PA, even the air conditioners sounded like held breath. The men communicated in fragments of motion, the tip of a muzzle, a brief point at a map, a nod toward a stairwell door that never fully closed. On the roof, a door opened to daylight with a whisper. A figure paused at the threshold, scanned the horizon, and raised a hand that was answered from below. The hospital, still outwardly whole, had been hollowed and reassembled as a quiet structure of angles and intent. No alarms, no declarations, just a space repurposed, compassion rearranged at gunpoint. In a corner of the waiting room, a woman began to pray without sound, lips shaping words her throat did not dare release. A man beside her folded his hands as if to mimic her calm, and found none. Staff moved when told, stopped when told, each instruction delivered with a precision that kept panic a fraction below ignition. What spread through the hospital was not chaos, but choreography. Each step, chosen to keep terror internal, to keep the world outside unaware for a few more necessary minutes. And so the day slid forward, not with a scream, but with an understanding. The threshold had been crossed, and everyone inside could feel, in the quiet of their bones, that the building now belonged to another purpose. The first sound was not a gunshot, but a low thud that sent a ripple through the building, as if the walls had swallowed a cough. Dust quivered in the fluorescent light. Somewhere, a metal tray rattled and then settled. Marley felt the vibration in the bench beneath her thighs, a small tremor that traveled up her spine. On the roof, a door sighed open and shut. A man passed the corridor with a compact radio pressed to his ear, his pace measured, his expression almost bored, like a technician checking a circuit rather than someone rearranging a sanctuary into strategy. Outside, the street changed shape. The idle motorcycle was gone. The delivery truck's door was fully closed. Now, its windshield reflecting a pale, distorted version of the hospital facade. Across the road, a cluster of men in brown uniforms stepped out from behind a barricade of sandbags, their mouths moving into handheld microphones, their eyes lifting to the roofline. They knew. Even from inside, you could feel the moment when knowledge clicked into place for people who carried weapons for a living. It was as if the afternoon took a breath and held it, waiting to see which side would exhale first. It came again, another dull percussion that arrived more as pressure than sound. Not an explosion in the cinematic sense, no splintering glass, no dramatic shower of debris, just force directed outward. The men inside the hospital barely reacted. They had already mapped this sequence in their bodies. One indicated a change of angle with a quick tilt of his wrist. Another adjusted a case the size of a toolbox, its latches taped. A third held a folded paper with a sketch of the block, lines drawn. To show distances and lanes, a box for the security post, a circle where the line of fire should not drift. Calculation layered over intention, cool and indifferent to the building's purpose. In the ward nearest the street, Suda guided two patients from their beds to the far wall, her voice a whisper that braided calm with urgency. She kept her hands visible at all times, offering the men in the corridor a respectful nod when they glanced in. as if they were supervisors checking compliance. The pretense of cooperation was a thin thread, but it held. The child in pediatrics began to cry, a quiet, breathless sob, not the loud wail that brings nurses running. His mother hugged him and rocked without standing, eyes on the floor, as though the tile itself might offer instructions for survival. Mali tracked sounds, the way a midwife tracks a contraction's rise and fade. She registered the subtle difference between pressure in the air and the slap of a distant return, someone outside, responding but with restraint, as if every shot, every decision, had to pass through a moral filter before it left a barrel. The hospital was still a hospital, even if men had written a different purpose onto its skin. That fact slowed the response beyond the walls. It was a terrible courtesy, the kind that keeps people alive inside while letting the men on the roof continue their measured work. The security guard stayed at his post, just inside the door, hands folded, the posture of a man waiting for a bus that would never arrive. A bearded figure gestured, and the guard shifted a few steps left, out of sight from the street, as if the choreography required his removal from the frame. The bearded figure's eyes were tired. Not cruel, not kind, tired. He had the manner of someone who had rehearsed this a dozen times in places that were never meant to hold rehearsals. He adjusted the tape on the latch again, more habit than necessity, then checked the hallway camera that no longer recorded anything but its own dark reflection. From somewhere above, a voice spoke in short syllables, the consonants clipped, the vowels brief. A man at the stairwell counted under his breath. 3, 2, 1. The roof door opened again. The building absorbed another pulse that wasn't a noise so much as a change in pressure, like the second before a storm breaks. Outside, the uniforms moved, crouch, signal, spread, practiced motions caught in a moral vice. The distance between roof and road could be calculated in meters, but the distance between what the building was and what it had become could not be measured by any known instrument. Inside, someone dropped a plastic cup. It bounced, rolled, tapped a baseboard, and settled. The tiny sequence rang in Mali's ears, louder than the events on the roof. She watched the cup come to rest and thought absurdly of the way small things stop moving only after the larger world tells them they can. She wished she could stop the same way. Let fear roll to a halt, but the baby turned beneath her palm and reminded her that some lives move forward no matter how hard the outside world clamps down. The men did not bark orders. They shaped obedience with economy. A pointed finger sent 2 staff into an interior room. A flat palm halted a patient who had stood to look toward the windows. A pair of eyes tracked the corridor angles, the way a beam of light would ricochet if the wrong door opened at the wrong time. They were building a machine out of people and space, and every quiet gesture was a gear, every pause a hinge. The hospital's own habits, cleanliness, order, discipline, motion, made it easier to repurpose. It was a cruel irony. The very qualities that keep patients safe became assets in a blueprint for harm. The reply from the street grew sharper, closer to a true sound now, as if the restraint outside had begun to fray. A crack, then another, the kind of sound that makes shoulders tighten and eyes narrow. Glass somewhere found, a hairline fracture. Dust sifted from a ceiling vent. The men in the corridor shifted weight, not in fear, but in adjustment. They were not here to win a battle in the traditional sense. They were here to shape time, to force a dilemma to flower in the minds of those across the road, advance and risk the sacred, or hold and accept the tactical wound. The dilemma was the point. Mali thought of the word sanctuary and tried to picture its shape. A word that once meant a building now felt like a posture, the way bodies curled around the vulnerable, the way eyes softened when pain walked in, the way hands steadied a cup for someone too weak to lift it. She felt the building's memory and the way her body remembered routine. Chart, greet, reassure, assess. She could do none of it now, her wrists bound with a precision that left no mark but removed all function. She looked at Suda, whose chin lifted the smallest degree, and in that fraction of movement Marley found a thread back to the world, where people chose care over calculation. A new rhythm took hold, built from muted steps and the murmurs of men whose faces were half cloth, half patience. The hospital had become a diagram drawn in air and held together by fear. Outside, a decision loomed, and inside, the people who most believed in keeping others alive measured their breaths and waited. The day had not yet decided what it would become in the story others would tell, but those within the walls already knew the title would be wrong no matter who chose it. There is no word that belongs with hospital and war in the same sentence that does not leave a taste of metal on the tongue. The next moment arrived not as noise, but as decision. A man at the stairwell touched his earpiece, nodded once, and moved with a quiet certainty that changed the temperature of the corridor. The air lost its softness. This was the minute when the building, already occupied, was turned outward, when the hospital's body was used to point at the world beyond its walls. From the roof, a measured sequence began, not a barrage but a pattern, a short burst, a pause to listen, an adjustment of angle, another controlled cough of force. The rhythm was surgical and cold. It felt like watching a heartbeat flatten on a monitor and then return in a smaller, paler wave. Below, the staff recognized the shape of what was happening without needing the words. Suda pressed the patients against interior walls, whispering reassurance that didn't quite reach her own voice. A doctor with grey at his temples, someone who had delivered babies and signed death certificates and learned to carry both weights, stood with his back to a window, shielding a patient with his body in a gesture so instinctive it contained no heroism, only habit. Marley sat very still, counting in, out, her wrists tingling beneath the plastic, the baby shifting as if to find a quieter corner inside her. She tried to keep her breathing steady for 2 lives at once. Outside, the security post answered with restraint, the kind of careful return that telegraphed a question rather than a challenge. You could feel the dilemma tighten like wire in the air. To push back is to risk the sacred. To hold back is to accept harm. The uniforms across the street crouched behind their barriers, faces lifted to the roof, fingers disciplined along triggers that had not yet accepted their fate. Radios crackled, a siren wailed far off and then cut out, strangled by caution. The street held a collective flinch and then froze there. On the roof, a man adjusted a small tripod, its feet pressed into tar that still remembered the day's heat. He didn't look like a warrior, more like a surveyor, measuring lines and angles, respectful of distances. He tapped the shoulder of the figure beside him and traced an invisible path through the air, away from the ambulances, away from the wards that held the most fragile lives. There was a line he would not cross, but the line he drew still violated everything the building stood for. He knew it. He proceeded anyway. That, too, was part of the calculation. Inside, the hospital's hum, the one built from beeps and footsteps and the soft clatter of care, had been replaced by a thinner sound, like wind through a keyhole. The men in the corridors continued their choreography, palms down, fingers pointing, small nods that carried the weight of unspoken threats. No one shouted, no one had to. Once, a woman tried to stand and move toward the restroom. A gloved hand appeared and, with a delicate pressure at her elbow, guided her back. The gesture was gentle in shape and violent in meaning. It said, "Your will is a luxury we cannot allow." Marley watched the face of the bearded man who had checked her restraints. She searched for something human to hold on to, a flicker of softness, a flinch, a doubt. What she found instead was a familiar exhaustion, the kind seen on night shift nurses or grieving relatives who had run out of tears. It startled her, that resemblance. He was not her, not them, not anyone she could make sense of, and yet fatigue had carved them the same eyes. For a second, she almost pitied him. Then another pulse from the roof quivered through the building, and the pity dissolved into a cold clarity. Exhaustion does not absolve choice. A patient in the corner began to hyperventilate. Suda knelt, speaking low, counting with her fingers to show the rhythm of breath, borrowing the language of control from a gentler world. The patient mirrored her count, eyes locked to her hand, and gradually his breathing eased. It felt like defiance, tiny and necessary. The bearded man glanced at them and then away, uninterested as long as their calm served his plan. Calm was his ally, panic was a risk. That was the cruelty of the moment. The skills meant to save lives were now repurposed to maintain silence for a different kind of operation. Across the street, a decision ripened. You could sense it, even without seeing the exact gesture that released it. A squad edged forward, then halted, then edged again, the way a person approaches a sacred object they are forbidden to touch. The hospital's facade, its windows, its crosses of light, stood like a witness forced to keep secrets. The uniforms kept trying to find a path that would let them act without sin, a path that didn't exist. One of them lifted a bullhorn and set it down again. Another spoke into a radio with the intensity of prayer. Time, lengthened, elastic and cruel, the roof answered with another precise cough. This time, the reply from the street was firmer, a brief crack, then silence, as if the outside had cleared its throat. A window pane in a stairwell shivered and halved a reflection of the sky. Dust drifted in a grace that mocked the weight of what it represented. Marley closed her eyes and saw her mother's kitchen, a tiled floor, a kettle like the one in the staff room, rising steam that meant tea and not fear. When she opened her eyes, the corridor had not changed, but she had. The moment had pushed a piece of the world out of her and replaced it with knowing. A man jogged down the corridor with a toolbox case, not hurried, not slow, the gait of someone who doesn't waste steps. He passed the pediatric bay, where the child's quiet sob had become a clean, exhausted silence. He glanced in and then away, as if memorizing the room's geometry rather than its pain. At the nurse station, he paused to draw a square on a scrap of paper and mark an X where a camera used to see. He folded the paper, slid it under his vest and kept moving. The hospital's blindness had become part of the plan. Another tremor moved through the building, this one answered by a hollow boom somewhere down the block, not at the hospital, but near enough to make the ceiling lights buzz. Someone outside had made a choice. Restraint, yes, but no longer paralysis. The corridor seemed to tighten in response. The men shifted positions the way a flock adjusts to wind. For an instant, the bearded man's gaze met Marley's again, and in that instant, she knew he understood what he had done, not just tactically, but irreversibly. He had taken a place of mercy and taught it a new language, one the building would speak long after he left. The minutes that followed felt like standing in a doorway between two houses. Behind, the life they knew. Ahead, a place where every floorboard explained a different grief. The hospital continued to function by reflex, nurses calming, doctors shielding, patients obeying, but its soul had been bent, stretched around a purpose that did not belong to it. That was the wound no bandage could hold. Outside, decisions would keep grinding forward until the equation resolved. Inside, the people who believed in healing clung to the last thread of themselves, the insistence that even here, even now, they could choose to be gentle. It was not victory. It was not safety. But in a day that had been turned against them, it was the only power left. Oh, ChatGPT dis, Marley learned to count time by the way her breath scraped her throat. In, hold, out. The plastic at her wrists no longer hurt. It had crossed into a numb, humming awareness, like a tooth you keep touching with your tongue. The corridor smelled of disinfectant and human fear, a mix that clung to the back of the mouth. She tried to picture ordinary things, and failed. The picture always became this hallway, this light, this hush that wasn't quieted, all but packed with unsaid instructions. She felt the baby roll low and slow, a reminder that her body was doing work the world could not see. She whispered a promise she hadn't known she carried. "I won't let this be your first story." Then she realized it already was. Across from her, Suda kept speaking without making a sound, shaping words with lips and eyes. Calm, sit, breathe. The men tolerated the choreography because it served their plan. Calm made rooms predictable. One of them passed. Close, boots soft, weapons slung, gaze a straight line that did not snag on faces. He smelled like rain on old metal. He paused at the window, checked the angle to the roof, and moved on. Marley watched his shoulder pass and felt hatred as a physical heat, then watched it cool into something colder and more durable, a refusal to forget. Hatred burns out, memory endures. She focused on small facts she could control, the number of ceiling panels between her and the nurse station, 7, the irregular. Flicker in the third fluorescent tube, short, long, short. The rhythm of the air conditioner, 5 beats hum, 2 beats pause. She named these things to keep her mind from unraveling. She pictured a chart with neat handwriting, her pen making the simple, clean curves of a blood pressure number. She pictured washing her hands, the warmth of the faucet, the paper towel tearing with a soft sound. She pictured walking out of this corridor with the same steady pace she used on regular days, turning left, greeting a patient by name. The imagination of normalcy became a form of resistance. The building itself felt alive in an unfamiliar way. It had a pulse now that didn't belong to care. She could feel it through the floor, a pressure from above, a tension from the street. When a distant crack answered the roof, the air shifted in her chest, even if her ears pretended nothing had happened. She thought of the hospital as a person pinned down and forced to serve. She hated that image because it was true. A place that had taught her to believe in neutrality was being used to argue the opposite. She suspected that after today, her body would walk these halls differently, even if the walls were repainted and the equipment replaced. The brain makes maps. Once a map includes danger, it never deletes the symbol. It only draws paths around it. A patient with trembling hands reached toward her. The gesture was timid, apologetic, as if he feared asking for help was itself a crime. Marley leaned. The smallest degree she could, let her shoulder be a point of contact. The man's fingers rested there for 2 seconds and then withdrew. No one interfered. The touch was nothing in practical terms. It changed nothing the men could measure. But something in her spine unlocked a fraction, and her next breath entered more fully. She thought, if the only power left is how we carry each other, then that is not a small power. It is the one they cannot confiscate. Her mind drifted to a lesson from training, preserve function under stress. She translated it into a new rule, preserve meaning under force. She looked at the bearded man and imagined his life in fragments. Someone who once sat on a bus watching rain smear a window. Someone who once listened to a woman tell a long story and didn't interrupt. Maybe none of that was true. Maybe she was building him a past to make the present survivable. But the speculation did something important. It kept the world from shrinking into roles, captor and captive, tool and target. Complexity allowed room to breathe, simplicity suffocated. The baby pressed a heel against her palm. Marley traced the small shape and named it privately, Future. Not a political future or a strategic one, but the ordinary future of a child who needs a cool washcloth for a fever and a soft voice in the dark. She held that picture and noticed how the room's edges softened when she did. The men remained. The plan continued. The roof traced its cold geometry. The street waited. But a second reality overlapped the first. She would one day tell a story that did not grant these men the last word. The thought was not hope, exactly. It was duty. The corridor exhaled and inhaled with the building. A plastic cup rolled again. Someone had nudged it with a shoe, and the tiny sound seemed almost obscene in its innocence. Somewhere, a siren swelled and receded, unwilling to commit to a rival. The bearded man checked his watch, made a small gesture, and two others rotated positions. No one raised their voice. They did not need to. The quiet had been shaped into a weapon sharp enough to hold the entire hospital in place. Mali tasted metal and realized it was the taste of fear, oxidizing into resolve. She wanted to be angry at the world for its rules, the ones that allowed a sacred place to be bent without breaking, to be used without technically being destroyed. She wanted clean lines, good on one side, evil on the other. But the day refused her that relief. The uniforms outside were cautious and trapped by conscience. The men inside were methodical and trapped by purpose, and the people who healed for a living were trapped by love for life itself. No line, then, only circles, one of force, one of duty, one of care. Each circle pressed against the others until all three hurt. Night thickened by degrees. The fluorescent lights gave the corridor a tired, lunar quality that turned faces into pale masks. Marley's wrists ached back into feeling. She let the ache be a message. Your hands are still yours, even tied. Your voice is still yours, even silent. Your story is still yours, even if today's chapter is written by another hand. She found Suda's eyes and watched a tiny nod pass between them like a contraband object. We persist. It wasn't a plan, it was an attitude. When the next pressure from the roof passed through the building, Mali did not flinch. She had run out of flinches. Instead, she noted the breath of the patient, the angle of the door, the weight of the bench under her. She counted quietly, making a music that existed only for her and the child. The corridor remained a held note. The men remained shadows with instructions. The hospital remained a reconfigured body that still remembered how to heal. The night made a promise she didn't trust. There would be a morning. She decided to believe in it anyway, not because the room offered evidence, but because belief itself could be a form of shelter. The scar had already formed. She could feel it in the way her eyes catalogued exits, in the way her hearing separated notes of sound for threat. She knew that in months, maybe years, she would still glance at rooftops without meaning to. She accepted that. Scars are not only reminders, they are also proofs that flesh continued. She bent her head, pressed her forehead to her bound hands, and breathed until the air tasted less like metal and more like air. The men were still there. The plan was still there. The dilemma outside was still there. But the corridor contained one more thing now, and it belonged to her, the decision to carry this wound as part of her, not the whole of her. If this story unsettled you, let it change how you look at the map of conflict. Hospitals are not stages for tactics. Compassion is not a tool to borrow and return. When places of mercy are held at gunpoint, the wound does not close when the headlines fade. It lives in the bodies and the nights of those who were forced to endure it. If you believe these truths should not be ignored, stand with us. Subscribe, share, and keep this conversation alive. Visibility is not the cure, but silence is always the accomplice.